My name is Michael Sutherland. I'm the Director of Urban Solutions with Hatch and the Canadian practice leader for our urban solutions practice here in Canada. Hatch is very pleased to be able to be part of this fantastic ULI Toronto Symposium. It's been a wonderful day and a half so far, and I know we've got a fantastic remaining afternoon, so it's going to be excellent. Hatch is a professional services firm bringing together planning, economics, and advisory with our engineering services that many of you know to bring 21st century transportation, sustainable energy, and development solutions to both our private and public sector clients, and we're really excited about a lot of the things that we're involved with. I'm also really proud to be standing here as a member of the ULI Management Board, and I just want to repeat, I think we've all been part of seeing what the amazing things ULI is doing here by bringing together discussions just like the one we've all been a part of over these past 2 days to move the needle as Richard likes to say, on city building and land use, the practice of city building, and what this region can be. And if you think about that, that's pretty substantial. I'm also honored here to be asked to introduce His Worship John Tory, Mayor of Toronto. Mayor Tory will set up the afternoon program, this terrific international panel that we have planned. And Mayor Tory, please forgive me for keeping your introduction short, but we want to get to this. I've been instructed that we want to get to our afternoon program as quickly as possible. The topic ahead is about a substantial, significant, complicated infrastructure project. I know the kind of projects I love to talk about, and many of you do too. And ULI, and I think also it's very significant that Mayor Tory is introducing this conversation because this is the Rail Deck Park is such an exemplar of a civic project that will be very significant on both a local, a regional, and I think many would say even a national scale. It takes leadership, something demonstrated by both ULI, this event, and I think the kind of leadership we've seen from Mayor Tory. And with that, I want to ask Mayor Tory to come and kick off the event. So thank you, Mayor Tory.
Well, Michael and ladies and gentlemen, I was a little worried there that Michael called it, what did he say, a substantial, complicated, expensive infrastructure project, and he's already falling into the category that sounds like the hand wringers that I'm going to make reference to in my remarks. I just look at it as a common sense, future-focused, visionary thing to do, and we should just get on with it. But that's what the panel's here to talk about this afternoon. May I acknowledge the presence of my colleague, Councillor Mary Margaret McMahon, here today from the City Council of Toronto. And I will tell you, I'll admit to you that I've invited all of the panelists who I had the pleasure of meeting in the next room to move to Toronto at the earliest possible opportunity. I'm not ashamed to invite everybody to move here because I just think it's a great place to live. And isn't that why we're here and why I'm so happy that the ULI under Richard's leadership has convened this panel today. Out of 100 times I get to speak and at some conference, 99 times I have to rush off to something else and don't get to hear the panel that follows. But today I was quite insistent on wanting to hear it because I want to hear how we can get this done. And it's all part of city building, really. I think it is part of saying what is it that we have to do to make sure that Toronto remains on that list. Not that the lists matter in and of themselves, but I think it's what they say about the city that we're building here that does matter. And we rank out of 4,400 cities in the world, I think is the number that they say exists at present. We rank in the top 5 in terms of livability every time a list is published. And the test for me of the success of the administration that I lead now, the success of all of our efforts on continuing to build a great city is whether 25 years from now we are still in the top 5 out of 4,400 cities. And I happen to believe this particular project is key to making sure that that is the case. We've got to make sure we grow. We've got to make sure we grow in ways that are smart. We know we're going to grow. That the city is sustainable, that we connect communities together, that we draw visitors, that we draw investment and jobs going forward, so that we're a success in every respect, economically, socially, and otherwise. So I'm very happy that this panel is taking place, and it comes just about a year ago after we stood, a number of us from the City Council, Jennifer Keesmaat, of course, who's going to moderate the panel that's coming up, and Councillor Joe Cressy, I should say, who's been someone that has been a big supporter of this since we came forward with it, and unveiled an ambitious plan to create a marquee public space for Toronto. It's called Rail Deck Park at the moment. I realize if you've seen that on the material, you may not think that's a very exciting name, but it's the best we could come up with for the moment because it describes the physical foundation, if nothing else, of what we're working on here. And I guess calling it Transformation Park would be worse. But I believe that it is going to be transformative, and it's one of the reasons that I was so supportive when I first heard of this idea that had been sort of kicking around the City Hall and said I think it was time we surfaced it. It's going to transform, frankly, what is a ugly but necessary use of city land, transform it by making sure that something goes over top of it while maintaining the important transportation use that exists there. It's going to transform an important part of the city by no longer having it divide the city from itself, especially from the waterfront. It's going to be transformative in that it will create a new citywide attraction like the Toronto Island, in the sense that this Toronto Island is a park, and one might argue it's a park that's physically located in the downtown area, but of course it attracts people from throughout the entire region and many tourists. It's going to transform the city in that it will address one of the single biggest areas of parkland deficiency, an area that is at present home for many thousands of people, more than it was a number of years ago, and will in turn be home for many thousands yet to come in developments that we already know are going to take place. It's going to be transformative as a part of the experience for visitors coming to Toronto, because I think it will become, if we do it right, an attraction that will be global in terms of people knowing of this park as they know of some of the attractions that are going to be represented on this stage in just a few moments from now. And it's, let's not forget the protecting part of this either, because by initiating this park and all the work that's being done now, culminating in a report that will come before the City Council in the next few months, we have taken the step for the moment, and going forward, I believe we will take the step of protecting probably the last opportunity of its size in the downtown core to create an exciting kind of open space and park that I think will be all of the things that I mentioned earlier on, but also protect it from becoming, frankly, otherwise just a few more office towers or a few more condo towers. And so I think it is an idea whose time has come, and the time is now. And I made reference to the hand-wringers. And look, I understand that people are going to ask questions, and properly so. And that's why we're writing up a very thorough report that is involving an awful lot of work being done by our very excellent city staff, a number of whom are here today. And those questions are legitimate. But what we can't let happen, and I'm just expressing my own very strongly held opinion here, is to let these things get diverted off to the side in the course of answering those questions. We are not alone in the challenges that we face, and they're challenges that talk both about growth, but also about the character of our city. And I think that the balance has become too tilted in favor of the growth part in the last number of years, as we managed to approved lots of growth, which means in many cases buildings, and paid less attention to the character of the city. And the character is still strong, and it's still good, and it still has a solid core, and that's why we still rank as well as we do on the livability rankings. But that's not going to last if we don't start paying more attention to the character, and that underlies the determination I have to bring a greater balance, to invest in character, and the character has to accompany, consideration for character has to accompany growth. So it means parks and open spaces and recreation and libraries and transit, of course, at the same time. So you'll hear today from people who have worked on iconic and inspiring projects from other cities in North America and across Europe. And I've had the privilege of visiting some of these cities. And what happens, of course, is that a lot of the ideas they've brought to life were things that at one time were just written down on reports. But it required determination. It required a lot of hard work to bring those to life. And that is something that is the right thing to do. It is the right way to go for this city. I can't speak, obviously, for other cities. And I think if you look at the sort of the look and the feel and the connectedness of this city, and you look at the future of our economic and social well-being, if you look at questions of inclusion involving people both who live downtown and who live across the city, this isn't just something that is going to be good to do. It is the right thing to do, especially when you face the deficiency that we have in an area of very high planned growth, not to mention the growth that's already taken place. And so I'll just conclude by saying that we must not, and I say this to the people who are here from Toronto, not so much to the visitors, but we must not get ourselves bogged down in questions of why not, or what are the reasons why we can't do this. We simply have to focus on how we can get it done. There are people in this room who are can-do people, who make their living and who make their careers getting things done. And I just hope that we can engage within the art of the possible, exchange ideas, listen to people like these people we're going to hear from today. Be prudent, be responsible, obviously, be ingenious, but at the same time be very determined to get this done in the interests of making sure we're a place that continues to attract growth, continues to attract jobs and investment, continues to be a magnet for social justice and for the kind of values that we believe in as Canadians. And I think we're up to that challenge. I think that people are increasingly concerned not just about building and growing a city, but about city building in that broader context that you all understand it. And I think there are people from across the city, including, I hope, some people in this room who believe in the rail deck park and who believe this vision is possible. And when you hear today what has been done elsewhere, I hope it will infuse you with that sense of determination to help me, help the City Council, help our city staff to make this happen, as opposed to finding reasons for it not to happen. I'm excited about the prospect of bringing this vision to life and making it happen, because I believe it will be a contributor to making sure that 25 years from now, somebody, I'll be long gone as mayor, I may be long gone, period. We'll see how lucky I am. Well, I'll be 87 then, so I mean, heavens above. I mean, I'd like to live to be 107, but who knows? But the bottom line is I won't be the mayor anymore, but I hope the person who is standing here as the mayor will be proud to say that we did that back in the early part of the 21st century, and in so doing made a huge contribution to the livability of the city. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the panel.
Have a seat, panelists. Thank you so much, Mayor Tory. We had a workshop just before this session with city staff, with our experts from away, and one of the things we heard again and again is the importance of leadership in making something like Rail Deck Park a reality. So I'm inspired by the comments of our mayor this morning. Clearly, we are beginning in the right spot. We are on the right track. We know that downtown is expected to double over the next 25 years to almost 500,000 residents. It currently has a density that's similar, you'll be surprised, to the density in London, England, right in the core of our city. And it's the fastest growing, densest area of the city already today. In city planning, we're undertaking a whole series of policy initiatives that are all about ensuring that as the downtown continues to grow and change, that it in fact becomes more and more livable. And we know that there's critical infrastructure challenges. We're looking at transit, at public space overall, at things like water and energy consumption, looking at the most appropriate built form. But a critical part of our work in the context of TO Core has identified that the availability of parks in this area is a real risk. Just to give you an example, in the downtown, we have calculated that 633 acres, or about 1.5 high parks, would need to be acquired just to give downtown residents a roughly equivalent amount of parkland on a per capita basis that exists for the average Torontonian across the rest of the city. That puts into sharp focus the magnitude of the park space deficit that we experience in the downtown. And we also know, although over the past decade we've added about 14 new parks in the downtown, they've generally been pocket parks. They've been small areas. They haven't been the kind of place where you can bring a child to learn how to ride a bike or to throw a baseball. And our downtown is increasingly becoming a home for families. We're studying how we can improve the design of units, the design of buildings, and the design of neighborhoods in our vertical communities to ensure that living in vertical communities offers a very high quality of life in the future. We know this is a critical part of creating a sustainable city. Getting the park space right, ensure we're responding to this existing deficit, is a critical part of delivering on that long-term vision. We know that the rail corridor between Bathurst Street and Blue Jays Way represents a unique opportunity. It's really the last site of this kind of a scale for a major new park in the downtown, both to respond to the growth we've already accommodated and the growth that we expect in the future. So Rail Deck Park will provide up to 21 acres of new parkland and stitch together a whole series of neighborhoods, improving access, connectivity in the downtown, offering a civic gathering space for all Torontonians and acting as a catalyst for tourism and investment. In light of the support of this initiative by City Council and the direction for staff to move forward and implement Rail Deck Park, we have convened this panel today to look at best practices from elsewhere. We want to learn from others who have undertaken similar, not the same, but similar exercises so that we can benefit from their experiences. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have the panel that you see in front of you, and we are going to spend probably about 45 minutes or so having a conversation about really case studies that have something to say, something to teach us as we embark on this bold city building initiative. At the end of the session, there'll be a little bit of time for questions from the floor. So if something comes up as we're speaking, by all means, jot it down, and we'll make sure that we have an opportunity to take at least a few questions from the floor at the end of the session. So I'd now like to begin by introducing our panelists. We have us here with us today. We have Jesse Brackenberry. Jesse, give a wave. Jesse is the executive director from the Rose Kennedy Greenway Conservancy in Boston. Some of you may have experienced the Big Dig. The Big Dig resulted in a mile-long ribbon of parks and green space, which is on top, of course, of this transportation infrastructure. It opened in 2008, and it features historical sites, public arts and gardens, food trucks, and hosts over 300 free events annually for residents across the entire city. Jesse plays a leading role in leading the operation, the governance of that space, bringing expertise in private-public partnerships, revenue generation, and external relations. Jesse, we're thrilled to have you with us today. Our next guest, our guests are not sitting in order. Our next guest is Daniel Jongteen. Daniel, give a wave. Daniel is an architect with Betham Crowell Architects based in Amsterdam. Daniel provides a deep knowledge of innovative public realm projects that he and his firm have worked on, often bringing together complicated infrastructure. Think of a train station that also has buses going through it and bike lanes going through it and ferries connecting into it, bringing all of these movement systems and public space together. And he works on projects both in the Netherlands and across Europe. And he's going to speak to us about a variety of those examples on the panel today. Next in line, we have Matt Nielsen, who is the Deputy Commissioner in the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events at the City of Chicago. And he is responsible for Millennium Park. Millennium Park, of course, is a 24-acre park that is built over none other than a rail corridor and parking garage. It was completed in 2004, and it is an exceptional precedent that we can, in fact, draw many parallels from for the work that we're undertaking in the City of Toronto context. The park continues to grow in popularity, and recently it attracted an estimated 13 million visitors in the first half of 2016 alone, which in fact would make it the most popular tourist destination in the Midwestern United States. And last on our panel, we have with us Jamie Torres-Springer. And Jamie is a senior principal at HRA Advisors in New York City. And Jamie is going to provide some insights for us today on the High Line. He, in particular, has provided expertise related to the evaluation of the financial viability, the economic viability looking at the rezoning of the Highline infrastructure and the rights transfers and the way that it impacted and really recovered the capital investment that in fact went into the infrastructure. So without further ado, I'm going to begin with asking all of our panelists a couple of quick questions off the top, and then we're going to drill down a little deeper because, as you'll note, we have expertise in everything from design to vision to governance to economic development on this panel, and I'd like to draw on the richness of the specific experiences of each one of our panelists. But first, a quick hit, a quick question, and we'll begin with you, Jesse, and we'll work our way down the line, and it's this. What is it that makes the project that you represent super special? What does it do that is particularly unique, both in terms of public space, but also for the city? Go ahead, Jesse.
So the Rose Kennedy Greenway, we take a very proactive role in trying to bring activity to the park. And we have over 400 free events and public art and food trucks and more. And our partnership with the city has really made this park an innovator for things, and the city has embraced the idea that we can incubate new ideas that perhaps they wouldn't be ready to do in the entire system. For example, have a glass of beer in a park. That hasn't happened in other parks around Boston, but this summer when we open our beer garden, the sky will not fall. And then it will become possible to contemplate those kind of ideas in parks elsewhere. And the same thing has been true with our public art and with bringing food trucks and so on. So I think that one of the things that's special is the way that the things that we're trying have ripple effects out into other parks and other public spaces in the city.
Great, that's a great example. It's not dissimilar from the role Waterfront Toronto has played in the City of Toronto context, trying things that we might not be ready to embrace more broadly. Daniel.
Well, in the case of Amsterdam, I think the issue that we had is quite similar to what you have in Toronto in terms of the rail. We had the I River cutting the city in two halves, and this transformation is about turning this I River from something at the backside of the city to the very center of the city. And that entails enormous development and also the redesign of a train station in the very center of it. And what I think is very important and special about this project is that the fact that we actually start using this water as something which is fun at the center of the city, and what also helps us to regulate all transit and all connections within the city. So we have within the station buses, trams, metro, anything, but also great biking lanes along the water, and the water really plays a big role in the experience in organizing that.
Fabulous, thanks. Matt, super special.
Millennium Park has been transformative in many ways to the city of Chicago, just in its proximation and what it's done for the portion of the downtown central business district, in linking areas which were not necessarily thriving, like our North Michigan Avenue retail district or our Loop. This has brought this together and created an incredibly vital arts and culture corridor that also links with our lakefront, but also regionally with tourism and internationally. And also the numbers, we've gone up dramatic percentages since the park opened in 2004. We are now one of the top 5 attractions or cities in the United States with visitorship. And then also, I think there's the iconic imagery of Cloudgate, the bean, or the Crown Fountain that have come to the city and sort of given the city a new brand, and that's very important internationally in asserting yourself, especially in a country like the United States when every city is really competing with each other on many different levels.
Great, thank you. Jamie?
You have to start with the design. That's the obvious thing. The care that was taken to build a user experience within the context of a reused rail viaduct, down to the 350 species, the horticultural care that was taken. But I think also in the context of this conversation, the other thing that's really unique about the Highline is that it was planned as a park and approved as a park, but it also spawned a plan that was approved at the same time for a district that surrounded it. So there was great care to think about what kind of value was getting created for the adjacent district. There were air rights that sat atop the High Line. There had to be a mechanism to allow them to be transferred off in order to make some of the owners underneath the line whole. But there was also a recognition that there could be a lot of value created in the surrounding district. And so, you know, the parts of the zoning, in fact, require buildings to create access to the High Line. They're very specific with bulk and massing controls about what kinds of buildings can be built so that they fit in with the line itself. So in effect, the High Line is sort of a creature that was approved as a great park, and it's become that, but it's also created a whole district and a place that works together very comprehensively.
Great, interesting. The theme of city building and connections, and not just being about parks, but about being about a whole bunch of other things is a really important theme that I think is emerging very early. I want to go back and link in this conversation right at the outset to some of the comments that we heard this morning from Richard Florida about the new urban crisis. Because if we, in fact, believe that narrative, if we believe the work that we see from David Helczynski identifying the challenges in cities like Toronto, really as a microcosm of what's happening in other cities, where there is a greater and greater divide between those who have access to the city and those who are excluded in the city, it raises a really critical question around parks and public space, because of course ideally they should be places that are welcoming to all. They should be places that are fundamentally shared. And if we see increasing exclusion in our cities, and particularly when we think about the downtown, you know, we sort of have this myth of the urban elites, but in fact, one of the things we learned through our work in TO Core that 1 in 4 people in the downtown, in fact, lives below the poverty line, which it's really important to insert that data into the conversation. But I think the flip side is there is this risk that there's a perception that these are sort of playgrounds for the rich. That's what we're building here when we talk about this kind of infrastructure. I'd like to hear from everyone on the panel, because this is such a critical issue that Richard Florida shone such a bright light on this morning. Are these really just playgrounds for the rich? What are we doing here? How does social inclusion become a key objective that we can deliver on in the context of building new kind of park infrastructure in our city? And whoever wants to go first, go ahead, Matt.
With the City of Chicago and our Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, most everything we do is free, free, free. That's what we say, free, 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 all the time. So that automatically brings a level of access and people feeling like this is a democratic space that they can come to and that they can enjoy something that is free and maybe is something that they may not have exposure to. One of the things, we adopted a cultural plan in 2012, and lessons learned since that plan are for us to move out of role of presenter and move into a role of host, and host those organizations from every corner of the city and every neighborhood, and make those experiences spread, not just be centered downtown, but bring that opportunity for people to come downtown. There are people in Chicago who have never seen the lakefront, and that is really an interesting point to think about, that we can use this park as a mechanism to open up that access for diversity and for inclusion, and to also expand our programming to host more organizations and to talk about not things radiating out from downtown, but bringing them into downtown and bringing all that inclusion together and moving forward with that. I'm very excited. I think we're maybe copying Toronto on Stop, but there's something we're going to be doing later in Chicago this summer that is really a culminating event, really highlighting and featuring the dance of our various communities throughout the city. So we're very excited about that and hoping that that moves the needle a little bit in this direction.
So Matt, just to follow up, if you were to give yourself a score on inclusion out of 10, where are you landing right now?
I would say we're between 7 and 8.
Okay, so you're moving in the right direction. Jamie, did you want to pick up on that theme?
Sure. I think it's a very real problem for the High Line. Last year, 2015, the High Line had 7.6 million unique visitors. Just about 2.5 million of them lived in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and that was a fairly demographically representative group that came to visit who live in New York. But the other 5 million, are tourists, and that's great for the city's economy. There's an enormous amount of benefit that's gotten created, but the place is crowded and the place is demographically fairly homogenous. And my friends Robert Hammond and Joshua David, who created the park, who I'm happy to represent here, by the way, and I love that I've gotten a chance to work to support them and other open spaces, but you should also read their book, because that's really how you find out about the High Line. But they will readily admit they failed. They say it pretty explicitly. They didn't think enough about how to represent those alternative demographics. The way the High Line is approaching it is, and which is a lot of what other open spaces do, is through programming, just like Millennium Park. 450 events a year, a lot of the 55,000 attendees at those events, and a lot of them are oriented toward programs for youth, summer programs. There are field trip programs. There are partnerships actually with community gardens in the South Bronx that they're running. They're doing technical assistance for other open spaces. But there's a lot of programming to try to attract alternatives. The other point I'd make that relates to some other New York parks that have a little bit more flexibility in terms of how much space they have is the best thing to do is not just to decide to program a place so that you attract a lot of people. It's to build the capacity for programming into the design. And so we see that. I was project director for a time of Brooklyn Bridge Park on the Brooklyn waterfront. We very explicitly concentrated sport courts, particularly basketball courts, in the middle of the park. Because what we wanted to do is to draw people from all sorts of neighborhoods who wanted to use recreational spaces, and we're able to do so, and have them actually come through the park and really embed within it. Another example I mentioned earlier, the Hudson Yards district in New York, which is just at the edge of the High Line, has its own open space, in some ways more equivalent to Rail Deck Park, but the city has put $100 million into creating a culture shed there, which will have its own accessibility issues, but the program for it is very flexible, and the nonprofit that's running it really intends to attract people from all across the city to come and use it. So you have to include those elements so that you can actually do the programming.
So that $100 million, that's money to build it and operate it? What does that include?
Build it.
That's big dollars.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Let's hear a little bit about Boston to begin. Where would you put yourself on that scale from 1 to 10? How are you doing in social inclusion?
I think it's an ongoing challenge and consideration. I think that I would give us a very high score for the efforts we're making. I think the results are a little slower. We have 400 free events. We have 7 water features, all of them free. And I think that our model for events, like the model that Chicago's moving towards, is hosting. So we tap into the creativity across the city and give it a place. And so, last year we had the African Festival and the Caribbean Festival and the Brazilian Festival, in addition to concerts and other things. And so I think that helps draw from across the city. We're also being very intentional about it because it is a park that is downtown, next to the financial district, next to expensive real estate. And so in Chinatown Park, where we are next to the Chinatown community, a more underserved community with less open space, we have started to do some produced programming there for families and children. And so we're trying to take a mix of take hosted programming that draws on creativity and fill in some niches where it can bring audiences into the park that might not come on their own.
Great. So massive emphasis on programming.
Yeah.
Like you're doing more than one event a day.
Yeah. Well, and given the Boston weather is a little bit like the Toronto weather, what it means is between April and October we have 3 events a day.
Right.
And not so much in the winter.
Right. Daniel, what about in the Netherlands?
I think we're doing pretty good. We have the risk of non-inclusiveness in the city center because it's small and we have rising real estate prices. But we have, I think, the very powerful connection between the Eye River open space and the transit system to counter that. And I think the transit system is very important because people don't use it out of idealism, but it's simply the best way to get across town. And because of that, it means that all people get to that area simply in their daily commute or when they want to travel through town. Now, what that means is that when I go to work, I cycle along the Eye River every morning. Just because it's the best way to get across, and it's faster than to go by car. So that establishes a connection between the open space and the transit, which really is for everyone, wherever you live, because you use it to go across town. So that's for the transit. As far as the use of the water is concerned, what you see over here on the screen is very typical. This is really for anyone. We actually swim the Eye River, and it is great. I do it as well in summer. And so that's an activity that I would say pulls people into this area from all over town. And so the risk of inclusiveness is limited because of the programming. We have the swimming, we have music theaters, we have kids activities. We have pretty much something for everyone there. And I think that's a very crucial notion to get social support and involvement of everyone in the city in a project like that.
So an important idea you've raised is this idea of really transportation and mobility through public space,
Right,
and that being
right.
a way of increasing inclusion. And I think this is an important idea for us to think about with respect to Rail Deck Park, because it will in fact be providing connections between east and west, between north and south, in an area where there's a really big gap. And if we think about the movement systems through the park, it will in fact expose the park, I think, to a lot more people who might not otherwise use it. I think there's an important idea there. I'd like to pick up on that theme of thinking about the impacts for the city as a whole. And Jamie, I'm going to direct this question to you, given the analysis that you've done around the High Line. And the question is this: what are the major citywide, city-building benefits that a project like this offers the entire city? Socially, culturally, economically, thinking about this not as being a downtown project, but this is an opportunity to benefit the whole city. Can you talk about that idea a bit?
Sure, of course. I think the important thing to do in starting to think about value is actually to work at a bunch of different levels and identify all the various kinds of value that you're creating. So there are, and we did in the original study that really led Mayor Bloomberg to make the decision to retain the High Line Viaduct and turn it into a park. You know, there are real estate benefits in immediate proximity. We initially looked at those. They were worth probably $150 million in property tax increment to the city over a period. We've looked back at that and studied it now that we actually have some data, comparing it to a comparable sample, and found that it's actually in excess of about $1 billion based on a city investment of $150 million. So that's important, but that's of course not what you're asking. But I'm going to come back to why I said it. When we looked back at the High Line and said, let's look at that impact analysis we did and figure out what needs to be added to it, we realized you need much more. We were seeing a lot of tourists come. A lot of them were saying that they were uniquely coming to New York to visit the High Line, that they were staying longer. We found that 500,000 a year explicitly said they were going to spend money in the immediate neighborhood. So the tourist benefits were huge, and actually in some ways, depending on how you count those tourists, outpace that property tax increment. But then, you know, what you're doing with a citywide amenity is you're creating quality of life. And as a city like this continues to build and build, there are all sorts of amenities that you need to put into place in order to have a sustainable work-live district in the downtown. And New York has done that too. Other examples in New York, you know, not just the High Line. A lot of people don't know, New York City managed to use a lot of the recovery money that it got from the federal government after 9/11 to build open space in Lower Manhattan, to support the migration of Lower Manhattan from an office community to a very mixed-use community. And those are the sorts of investments that generate value. And I'll come back to maybe to why I mentioned real estate as being very important.
Well, I'd like to pick up on a little theme there because really in many ways, when the High Line was proposed, it was sort of seen as being a way to address a problem. And it was really in many ways seen as being a neighborhood project. It was very specific, but it very quickly, because of the excellence in execution and design, and I want Daniel to pick up on this in a moment, it actually became something completely different. It became this amenity that was for the whole city and that also drew people from outside. I'm wondering maybe, Matt, if you can pick up on that idea. You mentioned earlier today about, on the one hand, we've got these incredible numbers around the crowds at Millennium Park, and on the other side, that it's something that people in Chicago really own. They feel ownership over it. There's pride about the city that actually came from the park. Can you kind of pick up on those themes?
Sure. One of the sort of generationally or over the course of time, Chicago has been a city of sort of big legacy projects, either connected with the World's Fair or the lakefront or other sort of grand projects of the time. Millennium Park was the first project in about 70 or 80 years, so many generations, where there was something that the civic and philanthropic community that helped promote the idea and fund the park gave back to the city. And the city and its residents were its first instant fans. And it just, even looking at something like Cloudgate, which is the image here, we call it the home of the selfie, dating ourselves back to 2004. But, really it just galvanized the city. It brought people together. It was a dynamic space that was so starkly different than some of the more traditional park spaces on our lakefront. And it really brought together the downtown, the lakefront, and all these other elements that I talked about of different districts of the downtown. But like what's been said, the civic pride and the ownership, people start their visit to Chicago at Millennium Park. And the people who live in Chicago who are hosting those visitors take their visitors to Millennium Park first. And I think one sort of factoid with that is the park has been open since June of 2004, so we're coming up on 13 years. Cloudgate has only been vandalized 5 times. So that's outstanding for a park that has tens of millions of visitors a year, is located in the middle of one of the largest residential downtowns in North America, but also one of the largest cities in the world.
There's a lot of people around too.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I just love the way that that narrative demonstrates the way it became a part of the identity of the city so quickly, because I think that's a really big part of the opportunity that we're seeing here in the Toronto context. And is that what you imagined? Can you go back in time? Were you thinking, wow, this is going to transform the identity of the city? Were you able to grasp that idea before it happened?
There were a lot of wonderful surprises that we had with the opening of Millennium Park. And in fact, some of the word that we're doing when we're talking about the park and other formats is calling it the accidental masterpiece. Crown Fountain, which was this sort of this active water feature of static pictures, digital pictures that changed images of Chicagoans that would shoot water every 5 to 8 minutes, turned into this new urban water park. One of the things we found we had to do was chlorinate the water because of the use of it. We also found some of the points of entry of the park, which we always thought the entry points were along Michigan Avenue. There's a substantial point of entry out of the Lurie Garden, which is in the southeast corner of the park, that goes over to our museum campus, lakefront, and Buckingham Fountain. So we've had a lot of surprises that are very pleasant. The numbers alone, I had mentioned we piloted a counting system with the park being free and no barriers, and a lot of points of entry that don't necessarily take a surcharge or a ticket or something like that. We had estimated the park's attendance at about 5 million per year, and just in that 6-month pilot in 2016, we found out we had just under 13. So now we're expanding that to the entire area of the park. The pilot just really involved going to Cloudgate, and we're going to leverage that those numbers both for the foundation and the efforts they're going to make to sustain the park, with the programming that they do and maintaining some of the artist installations, but also what we do from a free public programming standpoint. And it also tells a story. This park, for city funding, it's about $9 million per year, is funded by the hotel motel tax. So what we do as a Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events for the city, the more people we attract to Chicago, the more revenue comes back to us through that source.
So one of the things that struck me in our conversation earlier today was Matt said that they designed the park for a series of discrete experiences, and what they got is crowds. And it wasn't really designed for crowds, it was designed for these discrete experiences, and sort of a lovely problem to have, but practically a really important challenge. Daniel, maybe you can tell us a little bit, as a designer, looking at this kind of a process, one of the tensions we have right now and some of the admonishments we've heard from our colleagues in other cities is be careful not to try and do everything. On the one hand, this is going to be relatively big for the downtown at up to 21 acres, but on the other hand, it's only 21 acres. It can't be, baseball diamonds and playgrounds and event venues and. You have to make choices. How do you as a designer begin to get into that and ensure that you're going to deliver on something that is truly going to respond to the greatest need or the greatest opportunity for the city?
It's exactly what you're saying, basically. The thing is to begin with getting the intention very precise and to know what it is you want to accomplish. And in the case of what we're seeing over here, it was really the first thing to do was organizing the city, getting it to work. And that was the main intention. And all of the appearance of it follows off of that, I would say. And what I think is also important in a project like this is to set the standard at the appropriate level. And the city of Amsterdam has done a great job doing that because they realized, I think, from the very beginning that if this huge station project and waterfront project is to be in the very center of our city, it has to have the right level. And so they enforced the system with architectural supervisory boards and architectural regulations that lift the standard up from what you'd otherwise expect probably from infrastructure. But what's very important, I find, is how people respond to that. What we try to do is to make sure that using this transit system, the bus station, for instance, you see over here, becomes something very pleasant and comfortable. And to do that, you have to get the design right. Another example is a bike tunnel which we had to make to give access to this water. And making a tunnel is something which sounds absolutely horrible. It's unpleasant, socially unsafe. So what we did is design it at the best possible way, and it became a very beautiful tunnel with an artwork in it. And somehow that gets respect from people. We have not seen any graffiti since it was realized, and that's totally amazing. And I think that's the interaction between design and its users.
Well, and I have about 50 pictures of that tunnel, the Delft blue tiles,
it's good. Yeah.
from when I was there about 6 months ago, because it is so breathtakingly beautiful that it never even occurred to me until you just said it now that it's a tunnel. Because it feels like this beautiful public space, but actually it is a very practical thing too. Yeah. It's an access point. So it points to this role of thinking really carefully about the design actually delivering on the vision. And if you don't get that detail right, you won't deliver on the vision. Jamie, you can jump in here, but I also have a question that relates to this directly for you. Yeah. And I want to bring Jesse into the conversation as well, because you started to hint at the issue of governance in your comments, Daniel, that really the architectural controls, thinking about the governance, and that the governance is really critical to being able to deliver the project, both in terms of how you structure it at the outset, how you actually construct it, but then also how you operate it. And why don't you jump in, Jamie, and then we'll come back to Jesse to talk a little bit about how the governance model is working in the Boston context.
Sure. So quick follow-on point about design, which I want to say the other really important thing about that last conversation is focusing on who you want the user to be, being very specific. It's downtown office workers. it's people who live there, it's people who live in other neighborhoods in the city, it's tourists. How often do I want them to come? How long do I want them to stay? And then you get a program. And I think there's lots of examples, but, and this was, I would sound like I'm not trying to criticize Millennium Park, but I took my daughter to Chicago for the day a couple weeks ago, and we've been there a few times. Of course, we did get off the plane at O'Hare, go straight to Millennium Park. But she's 7. She actually didn't want to stay that long this time because it's like we've done the cloud, the cloud, and the fountain wasn't working, and
Renovated. It's being renovated.
But then we go to Maggie Daley, right? Which is I think it's probably not part of Millennium Park officially, but feels like it, which is great. Huge, insane playground. Designed by Michael Van Valkenburg, and it's a wonderful space. And so that made us stay for another few hours. And it's thinking that way about extending the stay that's really important in the design. On the governance, I think the High Line has a lot of lessons. It's kind of the pioneer of building a new open space with a public-private partnership. And I think, for just the real estate folks in the room and infrastructure folks, just think about it in terms of sort of the DBOM or the design, finance, build, operate, maintain. And each space needs its own kind of bespoke way of designing a partnership between the city and the nonprofit or whatever entity that you want to do things. So did a bit of work with the city on the Bentway. We sort of made a solution for governance that worked for that particular set of circumstances there, for whose money it was, who's programming it, what you're trying to achieve. This space also, you need to register sort of what's the city got to do here, who else is going to step up, how do I create them? How do I empower them to step up? And then what does that organization do? And it's a very particular thing to your goals and your users and your sources of funding and financing. Yeah.
It is particular, and I think we're going to have to struggle to figure out our old model here. You adopted the conservancy model from New York a little bit. How has it worked in Boston?
Sure. So on the spectrum, from parks that are maintained entirely by government to parks that are government maintained but with a nonprofit that supplements to entirely nonprofit maintained, the Greenway Conservancy is at this end of the spectrum. And I think that that's very effective and could talk about why it is, but that it is one end of the spectrum, and it was a model that was very unfamiliar in Boston. And to Jamie's point about the local context, while this is a best practice model, picking it up and dropping it into this context had consequences. We still have to frequently begin our conversations with donors or other stakeholders explaining that, no, actually we're responsible for the maintenance of the park, and no, your tax dollars are only a piece of what's paying for this park. In fact, what's making it special is those additional philanthropic contributions. And the fact that it was unfamiliar in Boston. New York has many of these examples, and therefore, if you're the High Line, you are standing on the shoulders of the Central Park Conservancy. Donors are familiar with giving to that organization, with that organizational model. And so it has been a challenge, and in fact, we were created, kind of enabled through legislation that initially set up our board, and then 4 years later, new legislation changed the composition of our board further as some lessons were learned. And I think that those learnings and those customizing of the model to the place and educating the city, educating the stakeholders about how it works is critical.
So Jesse, what's the relationship between you and the city?
So in our case, the Greenway is state land because it's the interstate highway tunnel underneath. And so our formal relationship is with the State Department of Transportation. Our relationship with the city is great because it's the best looking park in the city and they don't pay anything for it. So they love it. But with the state, it's more complex. They do pay, and as such, the questions of governance, the questions of reporting and oversight and so on are pretty complex and are I don't want to say negotiation each year, but it feels almost like that.
It's good to hear that you sort of tried to pluck a model from New York and adapt it in the Boston context and it had to be massaged to fit. Is that a fair way to put it? Because imagine then we're trying to pluck models from elsewhere into the Canadian context, which has a whole series of other, not only regulatory considerations, but also cultural considerations. The philanthropy that we see in our city is very low relative to the philanthropy that you see in your American cities. And I'd like to pick up on that idea, which is about how you convince people to contribute to something that historically they might think in their mind's eye is something that the government should pay for. Hey, I pay my tax dollars. I'm not interested in actually making a donation to a public space. How do you kind of get through that culture shift? And I know when it comes to Central Park, it actually sort of came out of desperation. The park was neglected, and there was a sense that if we don't do something, it will really go into a state of despair. We're not in that position in Toronto. Our parks are not neglected. We are reinvesting in our parks. But on the flip side, we do see that parks like Rail Deck Park really hold the potential for there to be a philanthropic role that may not have existed in the past. How do you get from one culture to the other? Because it's a very different way about thinking about the city and thinking about city infrastructure. Maybe we'll start with Boston, and then I'd like to hear about New York and Chicago as well.
So I think part of it is that philanthropists don't really want to pay to cut the grass, right? They don't really want to pay to reset the granite. What they want to pay for is public art and programming and new things that are, to what I said earlier, as we try to push the envelope for what can and should be done in public space, I think that excites a group of donors who therefore don't think of this as, well, I paid my tax dollars and I'm getting the same park. I also think that it's one of the challenges of this model, and I mean, one of the things that sort of Jamie is expert at is the challenge of getting those who benefit along the park to give as generously as they have benefited after the fact. And so if you don't put in place some sort of value capture mechanism, then you're relying on people's goodwill and their philanthropy. And that's not easy. You start to get a free rider effect where actually each of the conversations with any one of those property owners is, well, I'm happy to give, but the person to my right and the person to my left, the building to my right and the building to my left, they're not giving, but they're going to get all the benefit, all the financial benefit of my gift. And so I think I think philanthropy is critical, and we've been able to have real success in things like public art with philanthropy. But I also think that there is a place for a more structured contribution from those that gain a financial benefit.
Well, which might, our financial district is adjacent to this park, as are some of our biggest sporting venues. We have an incredible mass of pedestrians that will be flowing right into this park on game day when the Jays play, when the Raptors play. So there's an incredible opportunity, I think, to look at the corporate role that might be played. I think it's a bit trickier after the fact when you talk about residential, in part because it'll raise an interesting question about, well, what about the folks who live next to High Park, other parks in the city? I think it creates a very strange dynamic that's difficult to implement, except when you look at it through maybe more of a corporate lens. Jamie, do you want to talk about New York?
I think it's a complicated set of issues, and it is place specific. I think on the philanthropy side, there's a few kind of key things. And again, the guys at Friends of the High Line are amazing. They raise their entire budget every year, essentially from philanthropy and from earned income from the generated on site. Government can't be the one asking for it. Because people don't want to donate money to government. I know there are some exceptions to that, but it generally is the case. You have to be willing to invest in it. So on average, park organizations across the U.S. spend 25 cents for every dollar that they raise. So back to your original point, Jennifer, the motivation is to achieve that much higher standard of care and activation. And people are willing to contribute to that. And it does raise equity issues and all that stuff. But if you're able to demonstrate that you have this very unique asset that's in some ways not part of the park system, it's different in some ways, people are willing to give. Just on in terms of other sources, I agree. The way to kind of think about this is, what are all the sources of value that I'm creating, and then let me figure out how I can capture some of that value. So the citywide benefit discussion is the first most important thing, because if you're creating a space that has a citywide benefit, then you should fund it out of your citywide budget. You should fund it out of general obligation funds. That's the kind of rationale. There's a nexus between the benefit and the value captured. Having said that, there are spaces that generate incremental real estate value. There are spaces that generate a lot of activity and eyeballs. And there are ways you have mechanisms like BIAs and BIA-like structures. You have available tax increment financing structures you have available in Ontario and Toronto. Not much used in this context, but can be deployed if you're creating that value. And the last point, and this is something else that you can speak to, corporate sponsorship and recognition, it's a kind of thing that feels weird to people, and they feel like you're privatizing the park. But again, just in my head, going to Maggie Daly last week, there's like the KPMG slide. And the little sort of gold signs are everywhere, and look, you don't notice it, and maybe it's the subtlety of advertising and all that stuff. But certainly my 7-year-old couldn't care less. So I wouldn't be afraid of it.
Matt, I would like you to just give a short answer on the same idea in Chicago, and in the meantime, if there is anyone who would like to ask a question from the floor, Richard, should I direct them to the microphone over here? There's a microphone at the front of the room right here. You can't be shy for this task. Come on up to the microphone, and Matt is going to just give us the quick answer on the Chicago and philanthropy.
So one of the things that happened with the building and the idea of Millennium Park was there was a master agreement between the donors group that funded the sort of the frosting elements of the park versus the cake that the city made. There was a master agreement at the beginning that just said, this is what the city is committed to, this is what the donors group is committed to. There's also an ordinance that says, as part of that agreement, that privately raised funds will not be used for city offset. So if the sidewalks are cracked, or the bathrooms are not working, or there's some infrastructure issue going on, the city will not go after the privately raised funds that go into the park for its public art, for its programming, for the elements that are the attractions that brought people there. I think that's really important. And also, real quickly, what goes along with that, there is a special ordinance that the city council, and is in our city code, that basically governs Millennium Park to our department, that basically gives us some nimbleness in running it, along with city processes, but also keeping in mind that this is a special place and it needs some consideration when it comes to grants, when it comes to concessions, when it comes to a lot of the elements that make the park the success that it is.
I'm not sure who said it. It might have been you, Jesse, but this idea that the city pays for the cake and then the philanthropy pays for the icing. I think it's not a bad metaphor, because it's okay. We sure is, Matt. Sorry. Credit where credit's due.
It's the same thing. It's a Chicago thing.
But kind of an important idea that if you're in fact going to be looking for philanthropy, you actually have to clearly articulate where that philanthropy belongs, where it's achievable. Because I think intuitively you're saying something that sounds right, that people don't want their donor monies to fix the sidewalk, but they're very happy for their donor dollars to go into a public space that's unique and special and defining in some way. Do we have any questions from the floor? I will keep asking if we don't. Go right ahead.
This goes along right with what you were talking about, and it talks about the cake part. And so the challenge I find as a municipality is that the cake that our operating budget is based on a very basic standard. And so I could see using the philanthropic money to raise that standard, but the challenge is that then the cake becomes like the chocolate mousse kind of cake. And we don't necessarily have the operating budget at the municipal level to then maintain those higher levels of facilities. So I wouldn't mind hearing some commentary on how to deal with that.
Oh, that is so good. Where are you from? What city?
City of Kitchener.
Okay, so Janie Romoff must be in this room somewhere, Janie, and she is nodding her head vigorously at your moose cake, because we've had moose cake in the city. Fancy features, and we can't kind of take care of the baseline. Anyone want to comment on this moose cake problem?
Because I guess I
and then
baked the cake
Jesse?
that's here today, is with the evolution of the park being developed and opening, the people that make the decisions in the city made sure that it was a hotel motel tax funded and not property tax funded. And I think because it's an attraction, and the more we put into that attraction with hotel motel, the more our return is back. We are able to keep that park up and keep up with the expectations.
Great, thank you. Jesse?
In our case, part of the reason the Conservancy was set up was also because the City Parks Department and the State Parks Department both said, we will not be able to justify spending so much more per acre on this park than we do on the rest of our parks. But it will require it given the design decisions that are made. And so, you know, the interplay between the governance and the design decisions and the financing and so on, I think needs to be thought out up front because they're inherently connected.
Daniel, did you want to comment on that?
No, I would say I entirely agree that it's really important to be realistic from the very beginning and to have the right to set the right standards and make sure that standard can be maintained, and that's a pretty crucial thing. I think in Amsterdam that's going okay.
Question, another question from the floor.
Hi there. On the question of sort of equity and diversity that we talked about earlier, one of the themes that I heard across the board was just this sort of question around, you know, when we designed it, we weren't able to take that into consideration, but now we're trying to rectify it through programming. So I wanted to hear your thoughts then on how we could better incorporate diversity into the planning and design process so that it is part of how we design these public spaces.
Great question. How do we ensure that's a starting point? And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to raise it following Richard Florida's presentation today. How do we ensure we start with thinking about inclusivity? Matt?
I think one of the things that went into the design of Millennium Park was, and how it evolved from sort of a traditional to more of a contemporary space, was the Americans with Disabilities Act. That was a huge motivator for redesigning the park to make it universally accessible, and thus all the points of entry. There's really no closed point of entry. There's 28 points of access in the perimeter of the park on 4 sides, both and also from below, from the parking garages and such. So I think that, together with the universal accessibility in complying with ADA, was really important in starting that motion.
We're out of time, but we'll take 2 short questions. If you have a short question, go ahead, and a short answer.
I will be very short. It relates to funding, and what I was wondering about was, given the prime land that we've got here, is there an opportunity for example, a corner of the rail lands to be carved off and an office building built on it, that money then being put back into the park for maintenance? And has that concept been investigated in any of these other options?
So I'll maybe begin with the Toronto context, and then Jamie will take your perspective on the High Line. It's interesting because one of the really important drivers behind Rail Deck Park is a recognition that we need up to as much as we can possibly get of the 21 acres as a park. You'll recall my stat at the outset that if we were going to create the average amount of parkland that exists per capita for all Torontonians in the downtown, we would be building 633 acres of park in the downtown. Well, we're not going to get anywhere close to that. So we really don't want to compromise that very precious, contiguous area that we have. And in fact, the great news is that because there is so much development around the park, that we are already generating monies from other developments that can be used to pay for a significant portion of the park. So the funding, unlike in other files like transit, the funding is actually the easiest part about this park, in part because it is in a high growth area. Some of the other examples, even the High Line was an area that was more depressed, and the High Line was catalytic for the redevelopment of the area. That isn't the situation with Rail Deck Park. It's actually the opposite. We already have a high growth area with really high land values and a tremendous amount of more growth to come. So protecting the integrity of that entire 21 acres is really essential. We shouldn't be carving any part of it off, in part because there is other sites where we can in fact put development and growth in the city. Jamie?
Yeah, I would say, I think you're on a quest to create value, and like it or not, with constrained budgets as they are, you can be creating a lot of citywide value, but you generally pay for these things through creating, and exacting sort of local value. Millennium Park, there's a lot of parking revenue that goes into the park. The High Line, sort of didn't have development potential on it, but there was a recognition that there was incremental value getting created, so that was captured in a sense by the city, put into it. Brooklyn Bridge Park, a little more isolated, a little too much land in some ways because it was waterfront land, so 85 acres, and the decision was made to take 10% of it, 8.5 acres, build housing on it and some hotel, and put the money in the bank from the land disposition and use it to fund O&M for the park. But that was because it made sense in that sort of land context, and we were worried that we weren't going to be able to activate the park otherwise. We wanted to have more constituency. I think it's different here, but thinking about who is experiencing higher property values, and can you in some ways split with them their gains in order to put it back into the space is the way to go.
So we're out of time as a panel, but I would like, just because we're at the very beginning of our journey, and you're at very different points in your journey, I'm wondering if we could just leave with just an inspirational sentence. If you could look back, looking at where we are now at the beginning, some of you are in the middle, some of you are closer to the end. What do we need to know? What do you want to leave us with in the City of Toronto as a word of inspiration as we begin what we know is going to be a slog, but what we also know will be worth it? Jesse, we'll start with you.
At one point, there was an idea to put cultural institutions in a few places along the Greenway, and it actually proved to be infeasible. And retrospectively, I think everybody is delighted. They're delighted that instead, there's the chance for more open space in those places. And so, I think to your point about how precious this space is, you have a tremendous number of places where you can put buildings. It's rare to find a downtown area that has this much open space. And Boston was able to take advantage of that, and I hope Toronto is able to as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Daniel?
My advice would be if you're actually going to put a lid on the tracks and make a connection, then make those connections really strong and use them. If you can realize pedestrian and bicycle connections across the park, then it actually becomes something which is part of the cityscape and which people use and see as part of their everyday commute. And I think that could be a very powerful way of integrating the park into the city.
Fabulous. Thank you. Matt?
Free and accessibility, I think that is the key for the product of what is built here, and make it an attraction to where people will want to come back. You do have all the dynamic venues around it, but give it a sense of place that isn't just relying on sports or the residents. Create a there that people will want to come back to no matter how many times they come to Toronto or they live here.
Great. Thank you. Jamie?
I think something that didn't come up as much is nurture and generate constituency and advocacy and support. The High Line exists because there were these two guys, Robert Hammond and Joshua David, who just wouldn't give up, and they dedicated 15 years of their lives to making this into a space. And things can be government-led because that's where the resources are, but the character and the quality has to come from buy-in from all sorts of support. And so it's very important now to begin to generate some constituency. You'll see what it turns into.
Fabulous. Excellent words of wisdom. Thank you very much for joining us today.
So, Mayor Tory, Jennifer, our international panel, Jesse, Daniel, Matt, Jamie, thank you very much for your amazing and wonderful insights. We're about to take our final break for our Electric City Symposium and welcome in and shift gears to the Design for Unprecedented Growth, the City of Toronto Symposium. But before we do that, none of this could have been possible without the many, many volunteers who were part of ULI Toronto making this event possible. They worked hard over the last year, and we want to thank them. Their names are all up there. And if I could get a round of applause for all our volunteers.
So my name is Cindy Rotenberg-Walker with Urban Strategies here in Toronto, and on behalf of myself, Leslie Wu, Chief Planning Officer with Metrolinx, and our third co-chair, Mark Kinderchuk from Intermarket Real Estate, who is not able to be here, we wanted just to very genuinely thank you for choosing to spend the last day and a half with us. I know I speak for all of us when I say that this has been a really energizing, thought-provoking, cross-pollinating, Leslie says exhausting, I'm not sure if you could hear that, set of conversations, which is really what ULI does best. And so, again, we hope you enjoyed these last few days as much as we did. The virtual reality room is open for an hour and a bit till about 3 o'clock today. As Leslie said, we're now passing the baton to the city for their program, design focus program for this afternoon. But we wanted also to remind you that there will be a free public lecture at the Isabel Bader Theatre just on Charles Street, just by the museum subway station, featuring Elizabeth Diller from Diller Scofidio Renfro, who will speak more about the process leading to the creation of the High Line, as well as many of the other very exciting projects that they've been involved in. So again, thank you very much.